These days, Moscow feels like a city that's found its groove. It's loaded with new energy and seems to be on a non-stop celebration of its culture, history, and traditions. While Russia's capital has always been a place of power and importance, until recently, it wasn't that nice a place to live. With too many drab buildings, tacky shops, and uninspiring public spaces. Not so anymore. Moscow turned 871 years old this year, and at this extravagant street party, we found lots of people thrilled with what their capital has become.
Each year it's better because a lot of new streets, new parks. I think it's Moscow each year better. Yes.
Очень красивый стал город. Ну, раньше он, конечно, не такой был, но сейчас просто прелесть. Прелесть.
What's happening in Moscow has to rate as one of the most ambitious urban transformation projects ever attempted anywhere. But behind the new building facades and rebuilt roads and new amenities, there's also a shrewd political calculation about maintaining support for President Vladimir Putin. After all, Muscovites have been known to take to the streets when living standards drop. That happened most recently 6 years ago. Putin's administration has learned it's important to keep people in the capital happy.
Спасибо.
And Moscow's silver-haired mayor, Sergei Sobyanin, Putin's former chief of staff, is getting much of the credit for doing that, at least from Kremlin-controlled state TV. It recently aired an hour-long tribute documentary listing among Sobyanin's accomplishments a program called Maya Ulitsa, or My Street. In just 3 years, 300 Moscow streets were narrowed and the sidewalks widened. 12,000 buildings received facelifts. Thousands of kilometers of ugly overhead wires were buried under those crisp, clean new sidewalks that are also punctuated with more than 500,000 new street lamps. The joke here is that dug-up sidewalks have become so ubiquitous, the sidewalk paving stone, or plitka, is the new symbol of Moscow. The city has become a showcase for urban renewal, and young architects from across Russia are coming to learn what might work for their communities. And to get tips from top international architects, including Canadian Michael Geller.
If there were Canadians watching this presentation, they would be very surprised, because they do not appreciate that you have so many beautiful, lively streets.
Geller has flown in from Vancouver.
One day you will all come to Vancouver.
At the invitation of the Strelka Design Institute, its consultants have led many of the new projects. Geller is sharing how Vancouver has improved by creating density in quality public spaces. But after 7 visits to Moscow, he seems to be taking as many ideas back home with him as he's giving.
Each time I come here, I go back to Vancouver and say, you know, there's lessons we could learn from Moscow.
And one of them would be what?
To pedestrianize our downtown. We talk about pedestrians being important, but the quality of our sidewalks isn't as good as this. We don't have streets like this.
A decade ago, Moscow had just 1 pedestrian street. Now there are a dozen. This is a downtown area called Kuznetsky Most. Street cafes are everywhere. Push scooters and electric ones have replaced vehicles. And when you do need a car, Geller says ride sharing is ubiquitous.
I use Uber to get around. If anybody in the BC government is watching this, Chris, please encourage them to bring in Uber.
The cost of this transformation is unlike anything ever attempted in any city in Europe or North America. $3 billion US to be spent by 2020 just on Moscow. To put that in perspective, that's a third of Russia's entire municipal budget directed at the capital. Only in a country where power is so centralized in the Kremlin could that ever happen. And those costs don't include this centerpiece, Zaryadre Park. An oasis of nature and culture, it's just a stone's throw from Red Square. And at $250 million, it's likely the most expensive park built anywhere.
You can't purely celebrate places like this without trying to probe into the politics and the economics of how they work.
British anthropologist Michael Morawski has spent a year studying why Vladimir Putin's regime has invested so heavily to transform Russia's capital.
With this single gesture of Putin's, the golden land next to the Kremlin was given back to the city and its inhabitants. So it's this extremely kind of grandiose gesture of gifting which ties the park inherently to politics.
The park's defining architectural feature is a platform that sticks out halfway into the Moscow River, offering spectacular views of the city's famous landmarks. In a surreal scene when it opened last year, Putin took what seemed like a victory lap as the band struck up the theme from the last Austin Powers movie, The International Man of Mystery. It's hard to know what the Kremlin was getting at with that, but many here now refer to this place as Putin's paradise.
It's designed to create support for the regime, and this is very much the message here that you have received this park, you ought to be grateful.
Authoritarian regimes have long used beautifying cities as a way to glorify leaders. Still, what's happening in Moscow begs the question, can such improvements in urban freedom encourage greater political freedoms as well?
It's much too early to say whether Zaryadye and Maya Ulica creates a kind of democracy and freedom through architecture. The only things we have to go in so far is that people take many more selfies than they used to in this part of Moscow and on the Garden Ring, and that people voted for Putin in much larger numbers than they did previously.
Moscow's Renaissance is impressive, yet in other ways superficial. Daily commutes on clogged roads are still punishing. But Muscovites seem more than prepared to accept the deal Putin has offered them. A better, more beautiful city in exchange for letting him run Russia his way. Chris Brown, CBC News, Moscow.